What if the refreshing fizz of Coca-Cola was just a whisper away from igniting a global conflict? It sounds head-spinning, right? Imagine, the year is 1961. The world holds its breath, teetering on the edge of nuclear war. JFK is in the White House, Khrushchev rules the Kremlin, and the Iron Curtain stretches across Europe, a cold, hard line dividing east from west. But the battle for global dominance wasn't always fought with ICBMs and spy satellites. Sometimes it played out in the most unexpected arenas. Sometimes the battleground was a frosty glass bottle, a universal symbol of American capitalism and freedom. It was in this tense atmosphere, a world gripped by fear and suspicion, that a seemingly ordinary man, a Coca-Cola quality control specialist, stumbled upon something so profoundly unsettling it could have reshaped the geopolitical landscape forever. He wasn't looking for secrets. He was just doing his job, ensuring every sip of Coke delivered that familiar, sweet taste. But what he found wasn't a manufacturing error. It wasn't a tainted batch. It was a cold, calculated message, a spectral threat hidden in plain sight, engineered by forces far beyond a bottling plant. This isn't just a story about industrial espionage. This is the untold saga of how America's most beloved beverage became a clandestine weapon, and how one unassuming employee held the fate of nations in his hands. But before we dive deeper, you make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. What would you do if you're in this situation? It means a lot to us. We appreciate your support. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a barely perceptible whisper of something wrong. Meet Dave Harper, a man whose life revolved around the precise alchemy of Coca-Cola. Dave wasn't a spy, a soldier, or a statesman. He was a chemist by training, a meticulous perfectionist by nature, working deep within one of Coca-Cola's sprawling European facilities. Let's call it Plant Gamma. His job was simple, yet critical. Ensure that every bottle, every can, every single drop of Coca-Cola produced there tasted exactly the same as it did in Atlanta, Georgia. He was a guardian of consistency, a sentinel of the secret formula, operating in a world of pH levels, Brix readings, and chromatography. The year was, as we said, 1961. The Cold War was anything but cold in places like West Berlin, where barbed wire and concrete were rapidly replacing brick and mortar as the dividing line between two worlds. Coca-Cola, with its bright red logo and optimistic promise, was more than just a drink in these tense locales. It was a statement, a taste of home for American troops, a tantalizing symbol of Western prosperity for those peering over the wall. And Plant Gamma, strategically located in a neutral European country that served as a vital bridge for commerce and communication, was a key artery in this global distribution network. Dave's days were a predictable rhythm of lab tests and production floor checks. He knew the hum of the machinery, the scent of the syrup, the subtle variations in each batch. He had an almost uncanny ability to detect even the slightest deviation from the norm. It was a skill honed over years, a deep, intuitive understanding of the product. And it was this skill that would thrust him into a nightmare far beyond the sterile confines of his lab. One Tuesday morning, a new shipment of raw ingredients arrived. Nothing unusual. It was a standard delivery for the flavoring agents, components that would be mixed with the secret formula concentrate. But as Dave began his routine inspection, something snagged at his meticulously ordered senses. It wasn't a taste, not yet. It was something subtler. A faint, almost imperceptible odor clinging to one of the bulk containers. He ran his hand over the steel drum, the cool metal feeling normal enough. But the scent, like a ghost of a chemical he couldn't quite place, lingered. He shrugged it off at first. Maybe a residual smell from the transport truck, or a faint cross-contamination from another product in the warehouse. These things happened, but Dave was a man who listened to his gut, and his gut was screaming that this wasn't right. He decided to pull a sample, something he'd usually only do if there was a specific complaint or a known issue. He drew a small amount of the liquid flavoring agent into a beaker, noting its usual clear, slightly viscous appearance. Still nothing obvious. He proceeded to the next step, a preliminary chemical analysis. Standard procedure checking for basic purity and composition. The machine's word, the readouts flickered. All green, all normal, but Dave's internal alarm bells were still ringing. He uncapped the beaker again, took a deeper sniff. The strange, almost metallic-tinged aroma was still there, faint but insistent. It was like trying to hear a secret whispered across a noisy room. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that if this smell made it into the final product, it would alter the taste. Not necessarily making it bad, but making it different. And different in the world of Coca-Cola was a cardinal sin. He decided to run a more advanced test, something usually reserved for troubleshooting complex issues. He set up a gas chromatograph, a sophisticated piece of equipment that could separate and identify individual chemical compounds within a mixture. It was slow, painstaking work. Hours passed. Dave leaned over the glowing screens, watching the lines dance, the peaks rise and fall. He was looking for any anomaly, any unexpected compound that shouldn't be there. And then he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible peak on the chromatogram. A ghost signature, barely registering but undeniably present. It was a compound he didn't recognize, something completely foreign to the standard Coca-Cola ingredient profile. His heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. This wasn't a stray contaminant. This was something specific, something introduced. His mind raced, cataloging every possible explanation. An accidental spill. Unlikely given the compound's non-standard nature. A manufacturing defect from the supplier. Possible but highly irregular. He ran the test again, using a fresh sample from a different part of the same drum. The same ghost peak appeared. He then sampled from a different drum in the same shipment. Again, there it was. Small, hidden, but consistently present across the entire delivery. Dave Harper stood there, the chromatograph humming softly, the faint, metallic aroma still teasing his nostrils. The ghost peak on the screen was a silent scream, a chemical signature of male intent. His first instinct was pure scientific curiosity. Identify the compound. But a colder, more primal alarm was sounding in the back of his mind. This wasn't about an off flavor. This felt bigger, more deliberate. He immediately alerted his supervisor, Mr. Schmidt, a stoic German veteran who had seen everything from rationing to post-war industrial reconstruction. Schmidt, initially skeptical, ran the tests himself. His brow furrowed as he watched the same tiny, alien peak appear on his own readouts. Unerhört, he murmured, unheard of. Even Schmidt, with decades of experience, had never seen anything quite like it. It wasn't a known adulterant. It wasn't poison, at least not in detectable quantities that would raise immediate red flags. It was something else, something purposeful. The first hurdle was tracing the origin. Coca-Cola's supply chain was a marvel of global logistics. Ingredients came from dozens of countries, processed by multiple suppliers, shipped through a labyrinth of ports and warehouses. This particular flavoring agent, one of the many components of the secret formula, came from a highly reputable chemical company in Switzerland. Dave and Schmidt immediately initiated an internal investigation. Calls were placed, records were pulled. The supplier swore by their quality control, providing impeccable documentation for the batch in question. No abnormalities reported on their end. No complaints from other clients who received shipments from the same production run. This deepened the mystery. If the supplier was clean, where did the contaminant enter the chain? Was it during transit? During storage? Or more disturbingly, after it arrived at Plant Gamma before Dave had sampled it? They meticulously re-examined the receiving area, the storage protocols, the sealed containers. Nothing. No signs of tampering, no broken seals, no evidence of forced entry. The substance, whatever it was, had been introduced with a precision that bordered on surgical. Dave, now consumed by the puzzle, started tasting the product. Not the raw ingredient, but actual finished Coca-Cola, made with tiny experimental batches of the suspect flavoring. He'd prepare multiple samples, some with the questionable ingredient, some with a control. He'd blind test himself, then Schmidt, then other trusted colleagues in the lab. The taste was almost imperceptibly different. A faint metallic aftertaste, a subtle bitterness that lingered on the tongue masked by the powerful sweetness and fizz of the cola. Most people wouldn't notice. They'd just think it was a bad batch. But for Dave, the taste was a screaming siren. It was a fingerprint, he hypothesized. If the compound itself wasn't overtly toxic, what was its purpose? Was it meant to subtly alter the taste over time, slowly eroding consumer trust in a key market? Was it designed to cause mild, untraceable illnesses? Or was it something far more insidious, something that used the very nature of Coca-Cola, its global reach, its iconic status for a hidden agenda? The questions spun in his head, each more chilling than the last. As the days turned into weeks, Dave's investigation became an obsession. He pored over chemical journals, trying to match the unknown peak to any known compound. He even started looking into obscure industrial chemicals, things that wouldn't normally be found near food products. His colleagues noticed his intensity, his late nights. Some thought he was going overboard, chasing a ghost. "It's probably just a new variant of a preservative, Dave," one joked. But Dave knew better. This wasn't benign. His research eventually led him down an unexpected rabbit hole. He found a scientific paper, decades old, detailing obscure research into certain trace element carriers. These were compounds designed not for their own effect, but for their ability to bind with and transport other, often more potent, substances without altering the host compound's primary characteristics. The paper was highly theoretical, almost fringe science, detailing potential applications that seemed ripped from a spy novel: stealth delivery of microdoses, long-term degradation of materials, even subtle behavioral modification agents. The implications were staggering. If the ghost compound was a carrier, then what was it carrying? And if it was meant to transport something, how was that something activated or released? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't about destroying Coke. It was about using it. Using its global network, its innocuous presence in millions of homes, its very identity as a symbol of American influence. He remembered a briefing he'd once attended years ago where a corporate security expert talked about ideological warfare. How the Soviets viewed consumer goods, especially American ones, as tools of capitalist propaganda. Sabotaging such a symbol would be a massive coup. But this wasn't crude sabotage. This was sophisticated, almost elegant in its stealth. This was a direct, unseen attack on the very essence of American soft power. Dave Harper had spent his entire career safeguarding the integrity of Coca-Cola's taste. Now he was staring at evidence that someone had not just breached that integrity, but had done so with a precision that hinted at deep, unsettling knowledge. The idea that the unknown compound was a carrier for something else sent his investigation into overdrive. He wasn't just looking for a contaminant anymore, he was looking for a payload. His first thought was the secret formula itself. Was this an attempt to steal it, to replicate it? That was the oldest fear in the company. But the subtle nature of the anomaly argued against that. This wasn't about reverse engineering. This was about infiltration. He decided to approach the problem from a different angle. If someone wanted to introduce a subtle, undetectable compound into a global product, they would need intimate knowledge of its production process. They would need to know the specific stages where such an introduction would go unnoticed, the precise points where the existing flavors and aromas were strong enough to mask the foreign agent. This meant the saboteur wasn't just a disgruntled outsider with a grievance. They were a ghost in the machine, someone with a frighteningly detailed understanding of Coca-Cola's manufacturing secrets. Dave spent days dissecting every step of the ingredient processing at Plant Gamma. He reviewed old blueprints, interviewed long-serving employees about the specific machinery used for mixing and blending. He even traveled to the Swiss supplier's facility, posing as a routine auditor, scrutinizing their security protocols, their handling procedures, their waste disposal. He found nothing overtly suspicious, no gaping holes. The operation was tight, professional, yet the evidence of the carrier compound persisted. This led him to a chilling conclusion. The point of introduction was so expertly hidden, so flawlessly executed, that it bypassed all standard quality controls, both at the supplier and at Plant Gamma. It wasn't a crude act of sabotage. It was a highly sophisticated operation. He began to focus on the human element. Who would have such knowledge? Not just of chemical engineering, but of Coca-Cola's specific proprietary processes. He started building a profile of the hypothetical saboteur. This wasn't someone who wanted to blow up a factory. This was someone who wanted to manipulate the product from within. A chemist, an engineer, someone with access to sensitive industrial schematics, perhaps even someone with a background in food science or pharmacology. Someone with the mind of a meticulous craftsman, but the heart of an ideologue. Dave remembered stories from older colleagues, whispers about industrial espionage during the war, attempts by Axis powers to replicate Allied innovations. But this felt different. The Cold War was a war of ideas, a war of perceptions. Undermining American symbols was paramount. And what better symbol than Coca-Cola, drunk by millions worldwide, synonymous with American culture? He started compiling a list of former employees, contractors, even academic researchers who had ever had significant access to the core components of Coca-Cola's ingredient supply chain or even its production methodologies. It was a massive undertaking, like searching for a single grain of sand in a desert. He wasn't looking for traitors, not yet. He was looking for anomalies in career paths, sudden disappearances, unexpected shifts in allegiance. During one of his late-night research sessions, buried in old company archives, he stumbled upon something that made the blood drain from his face. A forgotten internal memo from the late 1940s, detailing a security review after a minor information breach at a European syrup plant. The breach involved blueprints for a specialized mixing apparatus, a piece of equipment unique to Coca-Cola's process, crucial for perfectly blending the concentrated flavoring agents. The memo concluded the incident was likely a low-level industrial theft, quickly contained. But one name on the review team stood out, a brilliant but enigmatic Eastern European chemist who had briefly worked as a consultant for Coca-Cola in the post-war reconstruction effort. He had extensive knowledge of chemical processing and a keen interest in logistical optimization. His contract was cut short for vague personal reasons. After that, he vanished. Dave felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This chemist, let's call him Dr. Valerius, had the perfect combination of expertise and access. He knew the inner workings, the vulnerabilities, the choke points. He could have easily identified the perfect moment and method to introduce a subtle agent into the vast Coca-Cola supply chain. And his background, Eastern European in the late 40s, immediately raised red flags in the context of the Cold War. Dave Harper now had a face, or at least a strong lead, for the ghost in the formula, Dr. Valerius, the enigmatic chemist from the post-war era. But the bigger question still loomed. Why? Why would someone with such formidable intelligence and precision dedicate themselves to subtly altering a soft drink? This wasn't about money. This wasn't simple corporate espionage. This was something far grander, far more dangerous. He took his findings, the consistent presence of the carrier compound, the inability to trace it to a supplier defect, and the compelling evidence pointing to a highly knowledgeable insider like Dr. Valerius, to Mr. Schmidt. Schmidt listened intently, his face grim. He understood the implications immediately. "This isn't a problem for corporate security, Dave," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is something else entirely." Schmidt, a man of quiet connections, made a discreet call. Not to Atlanta headquarters initially, but to an old acquaintance, a contact he'd cultivated during his time working with Allied forces after the war. This man, a retired intelligence officer now working in a shadowy advisory capacity, arrived at Plant Gamma 2 days later, under the guise of an industrial efficiency consultant. He was a gaunt man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, carrying an air of quiet authority that belied his unassuming appearance. Dave laid out his evidence. The chromatograms, his research on carrier compounds, the peculiar circumstances surrounding Dr. Valerius. The consultant, who introduced himself only as Mr. Thorne, listened without interruption, occasionally making a note in a small, leather-bound notebook. When Dave finished, Thorne steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on the ghost peak on the chromatogram. "A brilliant stratagem," Thorne finally said, his voice dry. "Hidden in plain sight, leveraging the very symbol it seeks to undermine." He then turned to Dave. "Tell me, Mr. Harper, what do you believe this carrier is carrying?" Dave hesitated. "My research indicates these compounds can transport trace elements, anything from biological agents to extremely potent chemical substances, even data in a microencapsulated form, something designed to activate under specific conditions or to have a cumulative long-term effect." Thorne nodded slowly. "Precisely, and consider the target, Coca-Cola, a global emblem of the American way of life. Imagine the psychological impact if such an iconic product were compromised, discovered to be a vector for illness, or worse, for a subtle form of control. The blow to American prestige would be immeasurable. The propaganda value for the Soviets, priceless." He then began to weave a terrifying tapestry, connecting Dave's precise scientific data to the geopolitical chessboard of the Cold War. Thorne explained how the Soviets, masters of psychological warfare, were constantly looking for innovative ways to destabilize Western societies without firing a shot. They understood that symbols held power, and no symbol was more universally recognized, more deeply ingrained in global consciousness than Coca-Cola. He spoke of Project Molniya, a rumored Soviet initiative focused on exploiting consumer goods and cultural exports for subversive purposes. Molniya, meaning lightning, aimed for swift, silent strikes against the ideological foundations of the West. If Coca-Cola could be subtly tainted, causing widespread, inexplicable public health issues, or even simply a slow, eroding distrust, it would create chaos, sow fear, and discredit American industry on a global scale. It would be an economic weapon, a psychological weapon, all disguised as refreshment. The mention of Project Molniya sent a chill through Dave. He wasn't just investigating a product anomaly anymore. He was staring into the abyss of state-sponsored terrorism, meticulously designed to operate beneath the radar of conventional espionage. Thorne confirmed Dave's worst suspicions about Dr. Valerius. Valerius, Thorne explained, was indeed a brilliant mind, and he disappeared behind the Iron Curtain in '49. We've had fragments of intelligence suggesting he was put to work on unconventional projects. He was a sleeper, placed within your company, harvesting knowledge, then reactivated for a specific mission. The timeline clicked into place. Valerius, with his intimate knowledge of Coca-Cola's production, would have known exactly how to introduce the carrier compound at its most vulnerable point, likely at the third-party supplier, years after his apparent disappearance, using proxies and cutouts. The sheer audacity of the plan the patience required was breathtaking. "This is not a lone wolf, Mr. Harper," Thorne concluded, his eyes fixed on Dave. "This is the Kremlin. And this sabotage is not about destroying bottles of soda. It's about poisoning the very idea of America, one sip at a time." Dave looked at his hands, still stained faintly with the chemical scent of the unknown compound. He had spent his life safeguarding a taste. Now he realized he was safeguarding an ideology. The war wasn't just cold, it was insidious, creeping into the most mundane corners of life. He, a simple chemist, had become a frontline soldier in a battle he hadn't even known existed, a silent conflict fought not with bullets but with bubbles, and the chilling realization that the comforting fizz of Coca-Cola now carried the shadow of the Kremlin. The weight of Mr. Thorne's words hung heavy in the air, a suffocating shroud over the hum of the laboratory equipment. This sabotage is not about destroying bottles of soda. It's about poisoning the very idea of America, one sip at a time. Dave Harper, the man whose universe had always been defined by Brix levels and pH scales, now found himself plunged into a world where ideology was a chemical weapon and a soft drink bottle was a potential Trojan horse. The most terrifying question, the one that gnawed at his gut, was still unanswered. What was the payload? What terrifying secret was the carrier compound designed to deliver? Mr. Thorne didn't waste time. Within hours, the pristine, state-of-the-art lab at Plant Gamma was augmented by equipment Dave had only seen in highly specialized scientific journals. Tools used for analyzing biological agents, microparticle detection, and advanced toxicology. A small team of anonymous specialists, as precise and quiet as Thorne himself, arrived and began working alongside Dave, their movements efficient, their faces unreadable. Dave, initially intimidated by their covert efficiency, soon found common ground in their shared scientific rigor. They were all driven by the same urgent question. Their first hurdle was the sheer stealth of the operation. The carrier compound was designed to be inert, to exist within the syrup without changing its flavor, color, or basic chemical properties until activated. This meant that whatever it was carrying was also likely in a highly stable, dormant form. It wasn't a crude poison that would immediately sicken someone. It was something far more sophisticated. They ran every test imaginable. Biological cultures, spectral analysis for heavy metals, isotopic tracking, even incredibly sensitive immunological assays. Days blurred into nights. The lab, once a place of predictable routine, became a war room, fueled by stale coffee and an undercurrent of dread. Dave worked tirelessly, his unique expertise on Coca-Cola's specific chemical matrix proving invaluable. He knew what should be there. He knew the tolerances. He could spot the slightest deviation, the most subtle alien signature. One evening, exhausted, Dave noticed something peculiar in a series of extremely high-magnification electron microscope images. Tiny, almost imperceptible nanoparticles encased within the structure of the carrier compound. They were irregular in shape, unlike any crystalline structure he recognized, and appeared to be composed of organic material. They were so small they bypassed every conventional filtration system, every standard quality check. His heart hammered. This was it. The payload. The specialists immediately focused their efforts. They had to extract these nanoparticles without damaging them, then identify their composition and potential effects. It was like trying to catch smoke. The process was agonizingly slow, requiring delicate manipulation and cutting-edge techniques. Finally, after another sleepless night, they managed to isolate a sufficient sample of the nanoparticles. Then came the analysis. The spectral readings were baffling at first. They showed complex organic molecules unlike anything easily identifiable. It wasn't a virus. It wasn't a bacteria. It wasn't a known chemical poison. The structure was synthetic, clearly engineered. One of the specialists, a stoic woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, finally put a name to it, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a prion analogue. A prion. The word hung in the air, heavy with terrifying implications. Prions were misfolded proteins, notoriously difficult to destroy, known for causing devastating neurodegenerative diseases like mad cow disease or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. They didn't replicate like viruses. They converted healthy proteins into their own misfolded form, spreading like a slow biological cascade, causing irreparable brain damage. The diseases they caused were invariably fatal, with long incubation periods, often decades, making them incredibly difficult to trace back to their source. But this wasn't a naturally occurring prion. It's engineered, Dr. Sharma explained, pointing to specific markers in the molecular structure. Designed to mimic a prion but potentially with an accelerated action, or perhaps targeting specific neurological pathways. And the carrier compound. It's a delivery system, designed to allow the prion analog to survive the highly acidic environment of the stomach and absorb directly into the bloodstream through the intestinal wall, where it can then cross the blood-brain barrier. The room fell silent. The full horror of the plot crashed down on Dave. This wasn't just about discrediting a brand. This was about a slow, silent, undetectable plague, a weapon designed to erode the very cognitive function of its victims, to cause widespread, untraceable neurological degradation over time. Imagine an entire generation, subtly incapacitated, their critical thinking skills diminished, their societies slowly unraveling from within. All without a single gunshot, without a visible enemy, attributed instead to natural causes, or perhaps, ironically, to the stresses of modern life. And the genius, the terrifying brilliance of it, was the choice of Coca-Cola as the delivery system. The omnipresent beverage, drunk by millions daily, from leaders to laborers, across every demographic. The incubation period meant that by the time symptoms appeared, the source would be impossible to trace. No one would ever suspect the sweet, refreshing taste of Coke. Mr. Thorne, his face a mask of grim determination, broke the silence. Project Molniya, lightning, swift and silent. This is precisely the kind of weapon they would design. A weapon of insidious, long-term debilitation. A weapon designed to win a war without firing a single shot, by dismantling the enemy from the inside out. The revelation of the prion analogue payload sent shockwaves through the small, clandestine team at Plant Gamma. The stakes had just escalated from corporate espionage to a potential global health catastrophe. The urgent question now wasn't just what was being delivered, but where it had been delivered and how many unsuspecting people had already consumed it. The global network of Coca-Cola, once a source of pride, now felt like a terrifying web through which an invisible enemy could spread. Mr. Thorne took command. He immediately understood the need for extreme discretion. A public panic over a potentially tainted Coca-Cola supply would be catastrophic, not just economically, but psychologically. It would give the Soviets exactly what they wanted: chaos and distrust. The operation had to remain top secret, a silent war fought in the shadows. Dave Harper, now operating as a key scientific advisor to what was essentially a covert intelligence task force, helped reconstruct the timeline of the prion analogue's introduction. Based on the delivery dates of the contaminated flavoring agent, they estimated that the payload had been systematically introduced into raw ingredients destined for multiple bottling plants across Europe, and potentially even other continents, for at least 6 months. The insidious nature of the prion analogue, with its long incubation period, meant that countless individuals had likely already been exposed. The terrifying thought was that the first symptoms might not appear for years, even decades. The focus shifted from identification to containment and interception. Where had the tainted batches gone? Coca-Cola's meticulous inventory records, typically a corporate asset, became a national security tool. Dave and his team pored over shipping manifests, production logs, and distribution maps. They tracked specific batches of syrup, calculating which bottling plants had received the compromised flavoring agents, and subsequently, which markets had received the finished product. The geographical spread was alarming. West Germany, France, Italy, the UK, and several neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland. Even some shipments destined for American military bases in Europe were potentially compromised. The sheer volume was staggering. Millions of bottles, cans, and fountain syrups, subtly carrying their silent, deadly cargo. But how could Dr. Valerius, a single individual, orchestrate such a massive, distributed operation? Mr. Thorne explained that Valerius wasn't working alone, nor was he necessarily the one physically introducing the prions. Valerius, Thorne elaborated, was the architect. He designed the carrier, perfected the prion analogue, and provided the blueprint. But the Soviet intelligence apparatus has many hands. They would have used cutouts, unwitting or coerced individuals, to introduce the tainted ingredients at the source, likely at the highly reputable Swiss chemical company itself, or at a transit point. The Swiss supplier, initially cleared, was now under intense scrutiny. Without revealing the true nature of the threat, Thorne's team launched a parallel, covert investigation into their employees. their security protocols, and their shipping partners. They were looking for the single thread, the weak link, the moment of vulnerability that Valerius's plan had exploited. Dave remembered his earlier visit to the Swiss plant, the apparent professionalism, the tight security. But Valerius was a master of exploiting known systems. He wouldn't try to bypass security with brute force. He would have found a way to use the system against itself. Perhaps a corrupt employee, a meticulously placed substitute of a container, a subtle alteration in a packaging process. The details of the how were still hazy, but the where was becoming clearer, somewhere in the upstream supply chain, long before the ingredients reached Plant Gamma. One evening, Dave was reviewing a seemingly innocuous detail in the supplier's shipping records, a change in the type of valve used on the bulk drums for the flavoring agent. A minor cost-cutting measure, implemented by the supplier a year prior, which allowed for quicker, but slightly less secure, transfers. Dave's mind, always seeking patterns, immediately flagged it. This wasn't a security breach. It was a design flaw that could be exploited. He shared his observation with Dr. Sharma, who looked at him with new respect. A specific valve type, she mused. Easier to introduce an agent without leaving obvious traces of tampering on the main seal. Requires a specialized tool, but leaves the primary packaging intact. Suddenly, the image of Dr. Valerius, the brilliant engineer who understood manufacturing processes inside and out, came into sharper focus. He wouldn't pick a random point. He would identify the most vulnerable, yet least noticeable point of entry. The valve, a seemingly minor component, became a potential key to the entire operation. Thorne immediately dispatched a team to the Swiss plant, ostensibly for a routine audit, focusing on material handling procedures, specifically valve integrity. Their true mission: to forensically examine every drum valve, every pipe connection, every transfer mechanism used for that specific flavoring agent, looking for micro-traces of the carrier compound or the prion analogue, or any evidence of a specialized insertion tool. The discovery of the prion analogue and its widespread distribution turned the operation at Plant Gamma into a desperate race against time. The initial shock had given way to a chilling, relentless urgency. The question wasn't if symptoms would appear, but when, and what the devastating consequences would be. Mr. Thorne made it clear. They were dealing with a ticking time bomb, and every second counted. The immediate priority was to stop the spread. This meant a covert, global recall of all potentially tainted Coca-Cola products without raising public alarm or alerting the Soviet perpetrators. An impossible task, or so it seemed. A public recall of this magnitude, citing vague, quality control issues, would decimate Coca-Cola's reputation and play right into the Soviets' hands. But not acting was unthinkable. Thorne and his team devised an ingenious, if ethically gray, solution. They initiated a series of strategic market adjustments and product rotation initiatives. Bottling plants receiving the tainted ingredients were instructed to halt production of those specific batches, citing minor equipment malfunctions or temporary ingredient shortages. Existing inventory was discreetly purchased back by the company, often through third-party distributors who were told they were participating in market research or promotional stock rotation. New, untainted batches were rushed into production and distribution, ensuring shelves remained stocked. Dave Harper was instrumental in this logistical nightmare. His deep understanding of the Coca-Cola supply chain, his knowledge of specific batch codes, and his ability to quickly analyze which ingredients went where, allowed them to target their efforts with pinpoint accuracy. He worked alongside a newly formed logistics intelligence unit, a team of analysts piecing together a real-time map of the global threat. But intercepting existing products was only part of the battle. The source of the contamination had to be neutralized. The team dispatched to the Swiss supplier, armed with Dave's valve theory, worked under extreme pressure. They found it: a single, seemingly ordinary replacement valve on a critical transfer pipe that had been subtly modified. Inside, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a minute, spring-loaded mechanism, capable of injecting a prepackaged dose of the prion analogue into the passing stream of flavoring agent. It was activated by specific pressure changes, making it undetectable during routine inspections. A masterpiece of miniaturized malevolence. The mechanism was designed for intermittent dosing, explaining why not every batch was compromised, and why the ghost peak was often faint. It was also designed to self-destruct or dissolve after a certain number of activations, leaving no trace. They had caught it just in time. The mechanism was meticulously deactivated and extracted, securing the source of the prion injection. The Swiss company, kept in the dark about the true nature of the device, was simply told it was a faulty valve that needed replacement. Even with the source neutralized and a vast amount of tainted product intercepted, the grim reality remained. Millions of bottles had already been consumed. The long incubation period of prions meant a latent threat was still out there. The question shifted from stopping the spread to mitigating the inevitable. Mr. Thorne brought in medical and epidemiological experts discreetly through back channels. They began researching potential treatments or even just ways to detect the prion analog early, long before symptoms appeared. It was a daunting task. Prion diseases were notoriously difficult to diagnose and virtually untreatable. The scientists worked in utmost secrecy, knowing that the slightest leak could trigger global panic. Dave, exhausted but driven by a grim determination, found himself haunted by the faces of the millions who might unknowingly carry this silent killer. He wasn't just a chemist anymore. He was a guardian of humanity, tasked with understanding an enemy that operated on a molecular level. The Cold War, he realized, was no longer just about bombs and political rhetoric. It was about the very fabric of human health, the insidious manipulation of everyday life. He thought of the subtle bitterness he had detected in the taste, the almost imperceptible metallic aftertaste. He wondered if those slight changes were deliberate, a cruel signature from Dr. Valerius, knowing that those who sought refreshment were unknowingly ingesting something far more sinister. The elegance of the sabotage was chilling. It preyed on trust, on familiarity, on the very habits that made life comfortable. Dr. Valerius. The name resonated with a new, terrifying significance. No longer just a forgotten footnote in corporate history, he was revealed as the cunning architect of Project Molniya, a ghost of the past unleashed to wage a silent war in the present. As the clock ticked, the need to understand Valerius became paramount. What made him capable of such calculated, insidious malice? What fueled his hatred to weaponize a common beverage? Mr. Thorne, utilizing the vast, if often murky, resources of his intelligence network, began to piece together the fragmented life of Dr. Valerius. His real name was Valery Alexandrovich Krasin, a brilliant electrochemist from Ukraine. He had indeed consulted for Coca-Cola in the late 1940s, a period of rebuilding and desperate collaboration across fractured Europe. His technical insights were legendary even then. He was seen as a prodigy, often aloof, fiercely intelligent but not overtly political. But then came the whispers, the shifting allegiances of the early Cold War. Thorne's reports indicated that Krasin's family, once prosperous landowners, had been decimated during the Holodomor, the Soviet-engineered famine in Ukraine in the 1930s. Krasin himself, as a young man, had witnessed unspeakable horrors, the systematic starvation of his people by the very regime he would later serve. This didn't fit the profile of a loyal communist. It complicated everything. Thorne speculated. Perhaps a coerced defection. Or a deep-seated desire for vengeance, meticulously cultivated and twisted by Soviet handlers. They are masters at exploiting personal tragedies. But the meticulousness of the prion analog, the sheer intellectual depth required, suggested something more than mere coercion. It suggested a profound, if perverted, dedication. Dave Harper, meanwhile, found himself studying Valerius's old scientific papers, his published research from before his disappearance. He recognized the same brilliance, the same intricate attention to detail that went into the prion analogue. Valerius had published extensively on organic compound stability, microencapsulation, and the long-term effects of trace elements on biological systems. It was all there, the intellectual groundwork for Project Molniya, hidden in plain sight within the scientific community, decades before its deadly application. One particular paper caught Dave's eye: the long-term subversion of biological systems through non-replicative agents. It was a highly theoretical work, dismissed by many as speculative science fiction. But Dave now saw it as a chilling manifesto. Valerius had theorized about agents that could slowly degrade cognitive function, impair decision-making, and induce chronic fatigue, all while remaining untraceable. He had even discussed the potential for ideological reprogramming through subtle neurochemical alterations, though he presented it as a theoretical curiosity rather than a practical goal. This wasn't just about destroying America's image. This was about destroying its mind. The prion analogue wasn't just a neurodegenerative agent. It was a weapon designed to subtly dull the intellectual edge, the creativity, the resilience that defined a free society. It was a slow-acting intellectual poison, targeting the very essence of human thought. The concept of ideological reprogramming in his early work, initially a theoretical footnote, now took on a terrifying practical dimension. Thorne's intelligence network eventually unearthed a key piece of information: a defector from the KGB's highly secretive Department 12, a unit specializing in psychological warfare and biological chemical weapon development. The defector, code-named Sparrow, described Valerius, or Krasin, as he was known in Soviet circles as a deeply disillusioned man, recruited not through ideology, but through a promise of ultimate, untraceable vengeance against an abstract enemy, capitalism, which the Soviets convinced him was responsible for his family's suffering. Sparrow claimed that Valerius's early research on subversion through non-replicative agents had caught the attention of Department 12. They offered him resources, protection, and the opportunity to turn his theoretical nightmares into reality. Valerius, embittered and brilliant, saw the West as a seductive poison and believed his work was a counterpoison, a way to dismantle the system he blamed for his past. He wasn't a fanatic. He was a deeply damaged genius, twisted by tragedy and exploited by a ruthless regime. The defector also revealed a chilling detail: the prion analogue wasn't meant to cause immediate, fatal symptoms. It was designed to trigger a gradual, almost imperceptible decline in cognitive function, memory, and executive decision-making. The goal was to produce a generation of citizens who were less innovative, less critical, less capable of challenging authority, essentially, easier to control and less effective as a global rival. The long incubation period was crucial. By the time the effects were noticeable, the original source would be long forgotten, and the decline attributed to aging or lifestyle. The revelation hit Dave with a fresh wave of horror. This wasn't about mass casualties. It was about mass intellectual incapacitation. It was about creating a population of compliant drones, not through force, but through a slow, silent erosion of their minds. The true payload was an attack on the human intellect itself, delivered through the most innocent of vessels. The stark reality of the prion analogue hung over the team like a death sentence. Prion diseases were, to put it mildly, biological nightmares. Untreatable, incurable, and almost impossible to diagnose in their latent stages. The long incubation period was both a curse and a blessing. A curse because millions could be affected before anyone knew, and a blessing because it offered a small window, however slim, to find a countermeasure. But a countermeasure for something almost universally considered irreversible. It felt like a fool's errand. Dave Harper, however, wasn't one to give up in the face of impossible odds. He had spent his career dissecting complex chemical puzzles, and this was the most complex and most critical puzzle of his life. Working alongside Dr. Anya Sharma and the team of specialists, he immersed himself in the theoretical biology and chemistry of prions. Their lab at Plant Gamma, once a sanctuary of precise quality control, was now a crucible of desperate innovation. They started with first principles. How did prions work? They converted healthy proteins. So, could they prevent that conversion? Or, failing that, could they deactivate the prion analogue itself before it could begin its work? The engineered nature of Valerius's creation was their only real hope. If it was synthetic, perhaps it had a synthetic weakness. Dave meticulously studied Valerius's old papers, searching for any theoretical vulnerability, any hint of a chemical Achilles heel. He focused on the stability and activation mechanisms. The carrier compound ensured survival through the digestive system and absorption into the bloodstream. But once inside the cells, how did the prion analogue initiate its misfolding cascade? Was there a specific enzyme it relied on? A particular cellular environment it needed? Days bled into weeks, marked by failed experiments and mounting frustration. They tried everything: molecular chaperones to stabilize healthy proteins, enzyme inhibitors to block the misfolding process, even speculative gene therapies, futuristic for 1961, but explored theoretically to create resistant proteins. Nothing seemed to work without causing severe side effects or being utterly ineffective against the insidious efficiency of the prion analogue. The Cold War outside raged with headlines, but their own war was fought in microscopic battles against an enemy that defied all known biology. Dr. Sharma, her face etched with exhaustion, suggested they revisit the activation mechanism. Valerius designed this for stealth, Dave, but even a master craftsman leaves a signature. How is this thing activated once it's in the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier? Does it just start misfolding randomly, or does it need a trigger? This question sparked a new line of inquiry. If the prion analogue wasn't naturally occurring, it must have a mechanism for controlled misfolding, a way to initiate its destructive process. They theorized that Valerius might have built in a delayed activation, perhaps triggered by a specific physiological condition or even another chemical compound, to ensure the long incubation period. Dave remembered Valerius's fascination with trace element carriers. He theorized, what if the carrier wasn't just for transport, but also played a role in the activation or deactivation? Or more daringly, what if Valerius in his twisted brilliance had built in a safety switch, a subtle inherent weakness, perhaps a molecular kill code that could unravel his own design? Not a cure for natural prions, but a specific weakness for his engineered version. They returned to the chemical structure of the prion analogue and its carrier with renewed vigor. Dave, combining his deep knowledge of food chemistry with Dr. Sharma's expertise in biochemistry, began synthesizing various organic compounds that mimicked parts of the carrier's structure, but with subtle modifications. They were looking for something that could bind to the prion analogue, not to destroy it, but to stabilize it, to prevent it from ever initiating its misfolding. Like jamming a key in a lock before it could turn. After another agonizing week, Dave had a hunch. He remembered a peculiar bond structure he'd seen in Valerius's pre-disappearance work, a highly unstable molecular configuration that Valerius had theoretically explored for its controlled degradation properties. What if Valerius had incorporated a similar, subtle instability into the prion analogue itself, perhaps as a failsafe, or an inherent byproduct of its synthetic nature? And what if a common, inert food additive, a simple sugar alcohol already approved for consumption, could interact with that unstable bond, stabilizing it and preventing the misfolding? It was a long shot, a desperate hope based on a decades-old theoretical concept. They synthesized the sugar-alcohol compound, meticulously purified it, and introduced it into cell cultures that contained the prion analogue. They waited, their breath held. And then, a flicker of hope. In the treated cultures, the prion analogue's activity slowed. It didn't vanish, it didn't break down, but its ability to misfold other proteins was significantly reduced, almost to zero. It was like freezing a destructive clock. It wouldn't reverse damage already done, but it could prevent further damage. And crucially, if introduced before the misfolding began, it could render the prion analogue inert. The discovery of the neutralizer was a seismic shift in their silent war. It was a fragile victory, but a victory nonetheless. Now came the truly daunting task: how to administer this counteragent globally, discreetly, and effectively to millions who might already carry the silent killer within them. The clock was still ticking, and time was not on their side. Mr. Thorne, ever the strategist, conceived of a plan so audacious, so utterly brilliant in its simplicity that it bordered on madness. "We use their weapon against them," he declared, his eyes gleaming with a fierce resolve. "We deliver the cure through the very same channel they used to deliver the poison." The answer was staring them in the face: Coca-Cola itself. The idea was a stroke of poetic justice, a delicious irony. The same global distribution network, the same ubiquitous symbol of American capitalism that Valerius had weaponized, would now become the conduit for its own salvation. The plan was terrifying in its scope: a massive, covert operation to infuse all new Coca-Cola production, globally, with the newly developed neutralizer. Dave Harper's role was paramount. He had to scale up production of the neutralizer to industrial levels, ensuring absolute purity and stability, and critically, that it was completely tasteless, odorless, and undetectable within the Coca-Cola formula. It was a chemical tightrope walk, a delicate balance of science and stealth. Any change in taste, any discernible difference would alert the public, ruin the company, and most dangerously, signal their counter-operation to the Soviets. He worked with a dedicated team, swearing them to absolute secrecy, creating a parallel, top-secret production line within Plant Gamma, hidden in plain sight. The ethical dilemma was immense. Administering a substance to millions without their knowledge, even for their own good, was a profound violation of trust. But the alternative, allowing a silent, intellectual plague to run rampant, was unthinkable. Thorne argued with chilling pragmatism that this was a war, and in war difficult choices had to be made. "The greater good, Mr. Harper," he said, "is sometimes achieved through necessary deception." The logistical nightmare that followed dwarfed anything Dave had ever experienced. Thorne's network, along with covert support from Western intelligence agencies, sprang into action. Under the guise of global product standardization initiatives and new ingredient sourcing mandates, every Coca-Cola bottling plant in the free world began receiving shipments of the subtly modified syrup concentrate. Teams of intelligence operatives, disguised as quality control inspectors or efficiency experts, supervised the introduction of the neutralizer into the local production lines. The secrecy was absolute. No one outside the immediate core team knew the true nature of the new flavor enhancer being added. The risk of discovery was omnipresent. Any slip-up, any disgruntled employee, any curious scientist could unravel the entire operation. The Soviets, particularly Valerius and Project Molniya, were being meticulously monitored. Western intelligence agencies launched a massive surveillance effort, looking for any signs of activation commands, any unusual communications, any indication that the Soviets were planning to turn on their prion weapon. Dave, physically and mentally drained, found himself constantly vigilant. Every chemical analysis he performed on the new formula was scrutinized with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. He had to be absolutely certain the neutralizer was effective, stable, and undetectable. He also had to ensure it wouldn't interfere with the long-term stability of the Coca-Cola itself, a detail that now seemed trivial yet was critical for maintaining the deception. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, steadily, the neutralizer permeated the global Coca-Cola supply. Millions of bottles, cans, and fountain drinks now carried not just the refreshing taste, but also the silent antidote. The targeted recall of tainted products continued in parallel, reducing the pool of prion-exposed individuals, while the widespread introduction of the neutralizer protected anyone who had already been exposed but hadn't yet shown symptoms. Years passed. The Cold War intensified, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, then settling into a tense, protracted standoff. But the silent plague, the insidious prion analogue designed by Valerius and Project Molniya, never manifested. The intended cognitive decline, the slow erosion of intellect that was supposed to cripple the West from within, simply didn't happen. The world continued, unaware of the silent threat it had faced, and the even more silent victory that had been won. The counter-operation, the ultimate deception, had worked. The neutralizer, infused into every bottle of Coca-Cola, slowly but surely neutralized the prion analogue in those who had been exposed. It stabilized the engineered protein, preventing it from ever initiating its destructive misfolding. There were no widespread public health crises, no inexplicable waves of neurological disorders, no mass intellectual incapacitation. The world went on, oblivious to the invisible war that had been fought and won in its very kitchens and cafes. What became of Dr. Valerius? That remains a mystery, shrouded in the depths of Soviet archives. Did he ever realize his brilliant, diabolical weapon had been utterly nullified? Did he watch, perhaps with a slow, agonizing realization, as his meticulously crafted plan failed to yield the promised catastrophe? Or did he simply disappear into the vast, unforgiving obscurity of the Soviet system, his life's work a monumental failure, forever unaware of the unassuming chemist who had outsmarted him? History does not record. Project Molniya, likely after the failure of this ambitious plot, was either abandoned or redirected, its most insidious weapon diffused by a soda. And Dave Harper, the man at the heart of it all. He returned to his lab at Plant Gamma. His life outwardly went back to its familiar rhythm of pH levels, Brix readings, and chromatography. The hum of the machinery, the scent of the syrup, all returned to normal. He continued to safeguard the taste of Coca-Cola, but now his vigilance carried a deeper, more profound meaning. He carried the weight of what he knew, the chilling secret of a world that had almost been subtly poisoned, and the silent triumph of having prevented it. He was an unsung hero, a quiet sentinel in a world that never knew it needed saving from something hidden in a fizzy drink. He watched the world, year after year, with a unique perspective. He saw the resilience of human thought, the constant churn of innovation, the vibrant, sometimes chaotic, discourse of free societies. He knew, with a certainty that few others could ever possess, that these very things had been targeted and that they had prevailed. The Cold War continued to rage, but one of its most insidious battles, one aimed at the very minds of millions, had been silently, unequivocally won by a chemist who refused to ignore a faint, metallic smell. This story of a subtle war fought in the shadows might seem unbelievable, but history is full of such hidden conflicts, where ordinary individuals are thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It's a testament to the unexpected heroes who, often without recognition, safeguard our world from threats we never even perceive. It validates the importance of vigilance, even in the most mundane places, because sometimes the fate of nations can indeed hinge on a single, peculiar shipment and the keen eye of an unassuming employee. This silent triumph reminds us that the greatest battles are not always fought on battlefields. Sometimes, they are fought in laboratories, in supply chains, and in the quiet, unyielding determination of a single person. The Cold War was a crucible of covert operations, where the fate of millions often rested on the decisions of a few, and the unsung heroes operated in the deepest shadows. If this tale of a hidden threat and an invisible victory has captivated you, then you absolutely won't want to miss our next deep dive. Make sure to hit subscribe button.